I would never have thought about a chicken catching on fire, but
it has felt like life or death at the time.
Some may think that's linked to crime. Not really, right?
I spent nearly 6 months actually living in the office at one point.
I could see a lot of money was being wasted.
Completely.
Yeah.
And that, again, wasn't the business plan.
You didn't just assume that you can take what you have and put it somewhere else.
All right, that's the end of the company.
I'm Shona Grundy, founder and host of These Three Things, a podcast aimed at building a thriving and more inclusive startup ecosystem through sharing real lessons from people doing the hard work. We focus on the three strategically critical aspects of the startup journey: raising capital, finding product market fit, and expanding offshore. If you find this useful, please subscribe and recommend the podcast to at least 3 other people. We appreciate you lending us your ears and joining us for this episode. Today's guest is Phil Thomson. Phil is the CEO and co-founder of Auror, a globally recognised leader in crime reporting technology. Established in 2012, Auror has earned a stellar reputation in the New Zealand technology sector, boasting numerous accolades, including recognition at the New Zealand High Tech Awards, Deloitte Fast 50, New Zealand Innovation Awards, and Ernst & Young Entrepreneur Awards. Most recently, they clinched the prestigious Supreme Award at the American Chamber of Commerce. However, reaching this pinnacle of success was far from straightforward. Despite their unwavering commitment to addressing a clear problem, the path they navigated was filled with challenges and uncertainties. This is the subject we will explore today. Phil, welcome to These Three Things.
Thanks, Shona. Good to be here.
You started off your life as an IP lawyer, and while some may think that's linked to crime, not really, right? So, very different part of the law. Can you tell us a bit about how this whole journey with Auror kicked off?
Yeah, so I was a commercial lawyer. The only time I wasn't being in a courtroom was to be admitted to the bar, so not the criminal side of the law. But I was pulled into the founding team because, one, how do you set up a company? Legally, how do you do that? And then secondly, the problem around crime, which my co-founders had seen, we sort of dived into, was super interesting. And if you're looking at collecting information on behalf of a retailer, the privacy aspects were really important as well. So spent a lot of time diving into that area of the law. But the problem itself, for us, we went out and spoke to hundreds of retailers right across the country, and the simple fact was that they weren't reporting any crime that was occurring in their stores because it was too hard, it took too long. The cost of the crime wasn't, in comparison to the effort to report it, investigate it, and the rest of it. So there was no visibility over that, and there was no understanding of the true underbelly of retail crime, which is actually very organised. So that was sort of our genesis of looking into it. And quite simply, the question we asked is, how do you use technology to try and bridge the gap between retail and police, and how do you also use technology to keep stores and people safer?
Okay, so that's kind of really interesting. You did a lot on paper first before you even really kicked into getting in staff or anything like that. So how long did you probably spend doing interviews and things before you kicked into a real company?
Yeah, we did quite a lot. And in fact, part of the founding of the company, we went into a almost like a business case competition, which required writing a business plan. And I look back at that 10 years ago, and it's held pretty true the whole way through, actually. Obviously, the financials were a lot more aggressive. Typical for a startup, what we thought we could achieve in 3 to 5 years has taken 10. But we weren't from the retail space, we weren't from law enforcement, so we just looked at the problem as a problem and how to solve it almost from both sides. So speaking to retailers was really important. Spent over a year probably embedded with police in different ways to understand how they operate. And that allowed us to then build the product off the back of that. And then just the constant user feedback in that cycle made us learn, how to build product. And then secondly, we've almost become world-leading experts in the retail crime space just because of how much time we spent thinking about it and working with it.
And I would say, having worked with quite a few founders and entrepreneurs, that's probably a really big differentiator for me. So I often come across technology founders because someone needs to build the prototype, right? But they imagine what the problem is, and then they go and build it because that's what they do best. And I would say your deep customer interrogation and learning is actually, it's quite fundamental. Probably what has led you to your success potentially, amongst other things.
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of forced to. I think we're capital constrained, which meant that actually we did the whole of things that didn't scale. And one great example was our very first customer. We started in just 4 stores. We worked on a deal, and this is one of New Zealand's largest retailers. We perhaps said, would you pay for each store if we went and trained them and rolled it out? And they're like, sure, we're not doing any work. Brilliant. So Tom and I jumped in the car and perhaps drove the entire country and trained every single store, every single supermarket in the country. And we learned so much just from seeing physically how a user uses our product, and hearing their feedback of what they're seeing in their stores, the things that we could improve upon in the product itself. That was key for us, one around, again, building the product in the company, and then secondly, actually around the team, like how do we work together as co-founders as well.
You mentioned you were strained for cash, and so, I've had a look at your cap table on the company's register, and it looks like to me that you've raised capital. Have you raised capital, and how did that process start?
You've probably done, I'd say, 5 rounds of varying sizes over the last 10 years. Our very first start was in that business competition I mentioned earlier. We got second place, and we won $15,000. Got a big novelty check as part of that. We actually made that last over a year. So we did the almost typical bootstrapping founder piece, not paying ourselves any money. I spent nearly 6 months actually living in the office at one point as part of that journey. But we saw, particularly when we signed that first enterprise customer, we saw we needed to build a team out, and therefore we needed money to do that. And we also knew that we had to do that ahead, and almost put that growth ahead of profitability and revenue. So back then, so just talking 2014, the capital markets in New Zealand wasn't that as well set up as it is today, and there wasn't the same access to international capital either. So we raised a fairly small round, which lasted 15 months. That created some challenges for us, on reflection around where we were forced to probably hire a whole of junior staff. And I think one of the learnings that, actually if you hire one really great senior person, can often be better than hiring 3 people, but we thought bodies and people were, the more the merrier at that point in time. But like I said, that capital constraint is actually really helped us, I think, over the years, particularly when we first started, doing things that didn't scale. But then even more recently, just seeing the change in the capital market now, we know how to be capital efficient. We know how to be scrappy in different areas. And it also, I think, forces you and constrains you to think differently around go-to-market, building product, building team. Whereas some companies I've seen that have got too much capital, it's really easy for them to just throw money at the problem or hire a whole lot of people, which then makes it very difficult to turn around quickly.
The capital market is hugely constrained now. I know there's a lot of money sitting with the VCs, but they're a little nervous, and so there's not many deals that are closing as much as they were probably 2 years ago. So I do know that they're looking at the metrics of how well you spend your money. Are you at a stage where you've done all your capital raising, or would you raise again? And if so, why would you raise again?
Yeah, I think the best way to think about it is get yourself into a position where the next capital raise is and can be your last. Often you'll know that it won't be, but if you have that mindset of, whatever you raise at that point in time, if you're going to raise it, I think it's probably taking a step back. Figure out if you want to raise capital is probably the very first thing, because the thing that particularly first-time younger founders don't think about probably to the same degree is the difference that makes. So you end up being on someone else's clock almost. So you've now got time pressure. If you're hiring people, you've got their livelihoods on the line as well as part of that. You can often be forced to grow at all costs. Previously that's been forced by a lot of investors. But then also, if you're not confident around things like product market fit, which I know we'll talk about a little bit more, it also means that at some point in time you can lose the support of investors. So actually choosing the right investors, if you're going to do that, becomes a really important piece as well. But if you can bootstrap and last as long as you can, definitely do it, but also just be very deliberate around when you want to raise capital and why. And if you actually do need to grow the team and the product ahead of revenue, but customers are your best investors. If they're actually paying you money, that's ideal. So for us, like I said, for the beginning, we were sort of almost forced to, and probably our next couple of rounds, again, we hadn't raised enough, I don't think. So again, we were almost forced into that next round. But over the last probably 2 rounds, we've actually had the optionality. So we haven't had to raise, which is the perfect time to raise money. It means you can choose the right investors, you can take your time, and better terms if you've got the right company as well.
Right. So thinking much further ahead as well, So, I mean, how long does a raise typically take to close in terms of if you want to, raise when you don't need to raise?
Yeah. Our rule of thumb has been you're probably looking at a 9 to 12 month lead into it. And so, probably 3 months worth of talking to people, building out your own use of funds, your pitch decks, who your ideal investors are going to be, and then probably ideally less than 3 months of them working that down to who are the ones that you actually want to partner with and or who gives you term sheets as part of that. But then once you've got a term sheet, that's almost like the fun is over. You then generally have up to 3 or 4 months of due diligence, legal paperwork. It gets more complex. The earlier the round, in terms of the size and stage, the faster it is often to get away. But as you grow, it takes longer. And if you've got more shareholders on the cap table, then actually you're working with 3 or 4 different lawyers to get to the same position. So it gets way more complicated. And I think a lot of founders I've spoken to recently who've had a fairly easy run in terms of raising capital, they've less than 6 months runway and they're going, I might start raising capital now. Like, that's too late. Yeah. But back to your point, like, you need to be thinking at, what's that next inflection point ahead? So if you raise money now, where do you need to get to either grow into your valuation or to be in a position that you can then raise more capital?
I want to go back to this conversation that we just had about you with Tom. That's one of your investors actually has pointed out that you have a remarkable co-founder dynamics with Tom. And then you told me about the work that the both of you did to actually learn about your customers. I am aware also that you initially started targeting law enforcement with your product because that's where I think you thought the problem was sitting. How did that work out for you, and then where did you pivot, and how did you pivot to your primary customer?
Yeah, so there's three co-founders, Tom, myself, and then James Corbett, who's the technical co-founder, who's built some amazing things over the years as part of the product. We didn't actually know each other prior to starting the company, so we spent so a mutual friend brought us all together, and so we had to spend a bit of time learning how we actually work and operate together. And like I said, that sort of trip around New Zealand trading all these stores forced like Tom and I to spend a lot of time together in a really good way. So we learned how we operate. We're very different people, which actually makes us really strong together. So all of my weaknesses I have strengths and vice versa. So that's made it that across the years we'll be able to operate right across the company and looking and working together on that. But what we did see when we were speaking to retailers and police at the beginning was that there were problems on both sides, and there was opportunities of probably commercializing both. And for probably the first 2 or 3 years, we actually built the product with both in mind and took on a lot of feedback from both sides. But what we got to a point was going, if we kept doing that, we'd never actually make any hard decisions because there's too much to do and too much product to build. So we decided that actually retail we're getting more traction in terms of commercializing it. And ultimately it was their initial problem. The crime was happening in their stores. It was their people on the front line. They were losing money, and therefore they would be more willing to pay for it. So we continued to take feedback on board from police, but we deprioritized that versus making a product for retail. But the core part was that we always knew that police are a really important part of the crime solution. So they've always been users of the platform, and we just haven't commercialized that side of it. But they've been working closely with retail, and we've effectively digitized that entire way that the retail community and police work together, and modernize that whole process.
Was there any sort of data or proof points that you were looking for in your product market fit that help you understand actually the retailers are our primary customer and the police are our secondary users? Was there anything you were looking for, or any metrics? Did you use that at all to make decisions?
The easiest one is always revenue. Who was willing to pay for it? And again, it's slightly easier when you're focused on a commercial customer versus a government agency, just in terms of, particularly as a small startup, it's often harder to get buy-in with government. But we've managed to navigate that pretty well over the years as well. Net Promoter Score, in terms of actually the use of the product, that's always been great on both sides for us. Globally at the moment we're plus 70 NPS, so world class in that aspect. Interestingly enough, actually the police NPS is closer to plus 90, so they get a lot of value out of the product. And the question for us in the long term is, are they willing to pay for that, or will they pay for that? So that's interesting for us. And then there's a whole lot of data that we look into around usage and the metrics behind the product itself.
So potentially the police are just more of a longer sales cycle then, if you're saying,
Yeah.
they just take, being a government, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So I understand.
That's how we're approaching it, yeah.
I would imagine that law enforcement is really different in each country. So you've obviously worked hard within New Zealand to understand the market, understand what's going on with crime and how the police work with retailers. When you went to your next market, it was Australia.
Yeah, correct.
How did each market change for you? Was it the same, or did you notice anything? Or did you expect to go into Australia and go, I'm just going to cookie cut what we have in New Zealand and put it in Australia because we're cousins and it's going to be the same?
Yeah, we really took a learning mentality to how we grow the company. And so for us going into Australia, there was some natural things pulling us there. There's a couple of our customers are in Australia and New Zealand, so we tried to use that as leverage to get into those customers. But we also just knew that easy to fly to, easy to actually travel to, and for us, again, enterprise sales, our belief is that you often have to be in person. You're selling to other people. You can't do that effectively online for enterprise. The police and actually, in fact, the retailers, everyone we've spoken to would always tell you that they're unique in their situations and what they do, but ultimately they all face the same problem. And we saw that, and we'd done our desktop research, but being in market allowed us to see some of those discrepancies that you probably wouldn't otherwise get other than being there. So being on the ground was really important. The scale was probably one part of that, just in terms of dealing with larger customers, bigger data sets. So actually, how do you build and grow the product there, and then the complexity as well. So they expect more features within the product, for instance, that we hadn't had from our New Zealand customers. So we learned a lot of that, and we also learned how to scale a team as part of that growth as well. Communication, working with people, having people that are remote, and again, that was probably 2016, 2017. So not as easy to do as it is today with technology and tools. But that just made it really important. Ultimately, our focus has always been, and in that first business plan, the US market has been our core focus as a company. We just knew we had to take, almost a step in each direction to get into that market. And Australia was that one for us. How do you learn and iterate in a larger market before we enter the US?
So that's typically, I'd like to go further into exploring how you went offshore, but most New Zealand companies do look at Australia first, and you did. Was that the right decision when you reflect back on that, and would you do that again, that part?
Yeah, for us it was the right decision, and again, it depends probably on what you're selling and who your target market is. And for some companies you can sell globally from day one, and that's great. But because of what we're selling and how we go about sales, we had to take it market by market. And again, we had to learn a lot as we went as well. So It was definitely the right decision for us. I think we, again, because we were capital constrained early on, we did a lot of that just by flying in, flying out. We took some learnings from that around having a team on the ground earlier, and we've taken that learning into the UK, for instance. We actually put some of our team on the ground full time there from the very beginning. But yeah, early on I would fly to Melbourne for one meeting, fly in first thing in the morning, fly out last thing at night, and just do what we have to do to get by.
I just want to pause here for a minute to tell you about our sponsor, Callaghan Innovation, Aotearoa New Zealand's innovation agency. This agency empowers innovators, helping you transform your world-bettering ideas into commercially successful ventures. What you may or may not know is that Callaghan have a fantastic suite of products called Upskill. These products will help you identify the innovation, R&D and commercialization skills you need to amplify and elevate your ideas, and then train you to put them into practice. So go check it out by heading over to their website, callaghaninnovation.govt.nz/upskill. How did your world expansion go? Where did you go from, and why did you choose each territory?
Yeah, so like I said, the US market for us, when we did our desktop research, clearly a large market for any company, but for us, it was the home of retail, law enforcement there. So to give you some scale, there's 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the US, there's 7 in Australia, 1 in New Zealand. So the complexity of that is actually our friend in the sense of how our product was built and how we think about network effects as well. So from probably 2015, and so we entered the US market in the late stages of 2019. But in 2015, we actually went to the US for our first trip there, and we went there intentionally to figure out and learn from that market. So we went to the biggest trade show. Who's there? Are there any other competition? Who are the retailers that we would want to be targeting? Does what we're talking about as our product stack up? What do we take away from there? And it was every year we went back to that show. We started to build up that there was connections with people in the industry. We became, we're still very small and scrappy, but we became, that's the guys from New Zealand who come to these events, which meant we actually entered the market. It wasn't completely fresh. But what we learned across that time was that the product that we had wouldn't actually work in the US like it was in New Zealand and Australia. In terms of the actual scale, again, of how we'd built and architected the product, and then the complexity around the feature set as well. So that research and being on the ground helped us to actually rebuild the entire platform. So we made the decision to effectively knock it down and start from scratch with that focus on the US market, and we were thankfully able to do that with the support of our New Zealand and Australian customers, thinking about the long-term impact for them as well. But if we hadn't actually gone to the US market, we wouldn't have known that, and we wouldn't have then been able to just redesign and then take that forwards into that market. So it would have probably delayed us another three years.
So that's fascinating in terms of the research that you've again done, right? Like, you didn't just assume that you can take what you have and put it somewhere else. And I heard you say you did desktop research for Australia, and then your desktop research actually was in person and getting to know people and understand that market. So you didn't raise money and then go, and now we're going to put salespeople in here and just sell what we have. You were preparing.
We were preparing, and we're fortunate, I think, with the investors that we've had over the years, where a lot of them did push us, want us to go faster and hire more salespeople, but we backed our own gut on this and said now's not actually the right time for that. We don't think we've got everything in the right place in order to double down, and actually if you put $1 on the top right now, you won't get $2 out the bottom. So you've got to trust us a little bit, and that tension is really useful at that investor and board level, and it kept us on our toes. But more recently, when we turned around and said, no, okay, now is the time to go faster, put the foot down, they were pleasantly surprised, but we'd built that trust over the years that they could actually back our gut on that as well.
Okay, so setting those clear strategies and expectations with your stakeholders within your business helped you to form the strategy.
Definitely. And we've just been super focused. And I think that's what our team, but also our investors have really appreciated, is that we haven't just gone chasing all the new shiny things. We're very deliberate around the markets we've entered, the markets that we won't enter, the product that we're building, the opportunities that come in all the time from different verticals, from even within our own customers. Yes, we'll explore it a touch just to see, making sure that there isn't something bigger there that we're not seeing. But actually just going, no, focus is critical for us, and make sure that we do build the right product, the right team, and the right markets we go after as well.
I mean, when I heard you say there was 18,000 law enforcements in the United States, I just kind of went, well, that's big enough for most businesses, right? Like, at what point did you go, we've landed, we're in here, we're investing, but UK over there, had you completed, or what was your reasoning to keep expanding into other countries?
Yeah, we started to look at how do you lay the foundations for growth in 3 years' time. And so if we keep doing things sequentially, then you would have almost these peaks and troughs of revenue growth and growth more generally. So we're at a point where we're taking the learnings around how do we enter markets like Australia and then the US, and had a bit of a playbook, and then the learnings around putting someone on the ground. We've done a little bit of, again, in-market research. We'd flown in, flown out of the UK. We'd done a customer pilot remotely, but we learned again from that you have to be there. And there's a whole lot of just, they want to work with someone that's local. They want to be able to pick up the phone or, even do a Zoom call knowing that you're in the country. So at that time when we entered the UK, we'd grown the team enough that we had some other really good people that weren't founders that we were happy to go and put on the ground in the UK to set up the team up. And then off the back of COVID, we've also had some of our younger team members who haven't been able to do their OE going, hey, I'd love to actually travel the world. I'd love to go and still work for Auror though. Can I move to the London office? So we've built, that's really become important around how do you build culture globally as well. But for us, the thinking around the new market entry was really about how do we think about that 3 to 5 year horizon around growth and stacking geographic growth as part of that.
I mean, I've got so many questions. But in terms of, so I'm listening to you and I'm counting up the time zones, and I'm going, well, there's New Zealand, I think there's 3 in Australia, there's 5 in the United States, there's 1 in the UK. Are you anywhere else that we should be considering when we count your time zones?
No, that's the core focus.
So, and your founders are, all 3 of you, based in New Zealand?
At the moment, yeah.
So in terms of like your leadership style and how you manage the growth of your company going into these countries which have their own culture as well, and these time zones and these different customer profiles, what would you say your leadership style is, and how do you manage these teams around the world?
Yeah, I think the style has changed over the years, and I think as a small company and as a startup, you have to be involved in everything, and actually you have to wear multiple hats. We've pretty much done every role in the entire company between Tom and I. At some point in time, we're now privileged to have an amazing team who do those roles full-time and much better than we could do them. So that's been really useful. That growth and the expansion, again, it can be testing around how do you learn how to communicate in different mediums and different ways with different people. Some words that, New Zealand-centric don't land or mean something very different in the US market, for instance, as well. And some things that people say you've got to read between the lines, in the US and the UK. In some areas they're not direct at all around what they're actually wanting to say. So learning that has been really useful. But ultimately, the leadership style that we sort of share across Auror is around how do you be really collaborative, how do you have low ego, very flat hierarchy, so actually anyone can provide feedback. It's a meritocracy of ideas. So the hardest thing now is we're 140 plus people, is that we don't want to be a place where, we better do this thing because the CEO, it's their idea. We'd love to be challenged on getting to a better outcome or a better idea, and try and really foster that within the company.
And that's really interesting. I once had someone say to me, I thought that I had open dialogue. I was the CEO and it was very low hierarchy. And my co-founder said, they're never going to push back on you. You are the CEO. They're never going to tell you the absolute truth. Do you sense that, and how do you get around that to make sure that people are feeling secure enough?
Yeah. Part of it is you've got to model that behaviour. We've got a really strong executive team. So my direct reports are more than happy to give me feedback, and the trust that we have allows for that, I think. You just also have to be conscious around how you are communicating or sharing things. Part of that is also letting other people step into the light and actually take control of their areas and backing them. One of the things that often people say is like, you hire great people and let them go and do their thing. I actually don't agree with that. I'm much more about alignment. So definitely hire someone great, but how can you allow them to cheat? You've got 10 years of knowledge here of running a company, dealing with these customers. How can you make sure you're really aligned and work closer with them and they can bounce ideas off you? And you can be a sounding board, but actually working together, you'll get a better outcome than leaving someone complete to their own devices.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually seen that where I've said to the CEO, if I went around your company, I would say that there are 15 strategies going on within your business, and it just wasn't being held by the CEO that, like, this is our priority, this is our North Star, and what are you going to do to help us get that?
Yeah.
And it became kind of, I could see a lot of money was being wasted. And
completely.
Yeah, probably talking to your part about how you streamline everything as well. You've said that you've talked a lot about positivity being a non-negotiable characteristic. Maybe now it's time to explain that a little bit further about your style.
Yeah, I think as a founder, you have to be optimistic by nature, to throw away a pretty safe career, go after the unknown, put yourself in some pretty bad situations, personally and financially, in the short term. And so you've got to have some positivity around that. I think if you have too much negativity around, like, you've got to be a realistic optimist is the way I put it.
Right.
So you can't be away with the theories or naive about what's going on, but I think you have to always be thinking about what's the silver lining from a bad thing, or the way that we look at it now is almost a Buddhist mentality of whatever happened, like whatever the thing that happens in the moment, it may be either really good or really bad, but almost it is what it is. Like in 6 months' time, you look back and even that, we've had a number of challenges over the years, particularly with some key customers or key prospects that we thought we were about to sign, didn't sign for other reasons. And often that's, in the moment, it's like, all right, that's the end of the company. It's like that bad in your mind. And on the face of it could be, but actually, everything happens for a reason is sort of the way that we think about these things now. And maybe at the time we wouldn't have been able to be successful around onboarding that customer. Yeah. Or what happened then has actually forced us into focusing on something else at that point in time. So I think over the years, it's just we've seen so much ups and downs that we're trying to almost smooth it out a little bit. But as a founder, we're very self-critical of us and of the company and success. So the lows are lower than the highs are high often. So even just that we have co-founders, it's been awesome just to bounce off each other.
I can tell there's stories in there about like cliff edges and things like that. Is there anything now that you're like, I've faced the cliff edge many times and these are my tricks to getting out of it? Or is there kind of like a cheat sheet that you check off that go, I need to explore these 10 things to get myself out of this jam? Is there anything like that you could share with people?
Part of it is just trying to build a stronger network of people, because generally, regardless of what you actually do or what you sell, companies across their life cycle go through very similar stages and events. So being able to actually talk to someone else about it, often they or someone they know will have gone through that same thing. Mental health is super important, so actually looking after just your well-being. For me, that's often exercise, helps clear the head. And then, it is solo founders, like massive shout out to them, because having a co-founder that actually, if you're feeling down, so they can pick you up is so important, and have someone just to talk to about the hard things. But often, it can be just case dependent on things. But I think that the luxury of time and experience now is sort of helped to balance those things out for me. But at the moment, and in the moment, when we're 2 years into building a company, some of those things, it really did feel like the world was going to end for us.
Is there anything like, was it a customer that you turned on, or an investor that you managed to drag back in? Because I feel that this is where most people get to, like, this is the end of our company. Like, we've run out of cash, we can't deliver. Is there an example of something that you guys particularly did to save yourselves from something?
Yeah, I think the one of the key moments for us was there was an Australian pilot that was about to start. So we're about to roll out with a customer, and in enterprise sales, particularly when you're early on, perhaps one deal makes or breaks a year, or one deal makes or breaks an entire company in terms of capital available. So for us, it was really night before, got the call, hey, this big pilot that we've been planning for months isn't going to happen, and that was devastating. And it was no one's fault. Like, it was a supermarket chain, and they had been doing different technology pilots, and some chicken rotisserie caught fire. So it's something that was a completely random event. But because that happened, the customer decided that actually the new process for any new technology pilots had to go through this, big change management. They couldn't just go and try new things. So something completely random like that, like a black swan event for us, really put us on the back foot. So I mean, we had to go and look at, raising a bridging round. We had to stop thinking about growing the team, to reassess how we actually entered the Australian market. So it's all that sort of stuff. And I think over the years, there's been a few of those different cases where it has felt like life or death at the time.
That was a great story, though. I would never have thought about a chicken catching on fire. But, what are the moments within Auror that you're most proud of?
Great question. I think there's probably a couple of moments. The proper market entry into the US. So we rolled out with Walmart across their 5,000 stores as our first major customer there. And that, again, wasn't the business plan 10 years earlier. And it was the exemplar customer. Like, based on what we'd researched, actually, if we could help them just with their scale and complexity, it would have a material impact on them, and they are the world's largest retailer. So what a great customer to have. So when that finally came through, that was an amazing milestone. And then most recently, in March this year, we actually brought the entire global team together in Auckland, and it was amazing just standing up in front of 120 odd people at that time, and just looking at and just seeing what we've helped build, and the people that have been on that journey with us to build it as well. And that was a real sense of, particularly after 3 years of doing most things virtually, a real sense of the scale that what we've achieved so far.
Oh, that's awesome. I do recall hearing about that event. It sounded epic. In terms of Walmart, that was also something that we heard throughout the industry. It was like, my goodness, that is the whale. We talk about the landing the whale. How long would you say that customer took to actually close in the end? Because I think it's important for people to understand that if you're whale chasing, it can bring you down, and to be hunting other customers as well, but with an eye on these big customers. What was your strategy around landing such a big customer around like that?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I think we actually first met with someone from their team way back at one of those first trade shows we went to. So although not engaged in any formal process, that is probably 5 years in the making. And they were one of those people that we spoke to that helped us understand that what we had today in terms of a product wouldn't actually be the right thing for Walmart, or wasn't at their scale as well. So that was super useful. Going to market generally, and again, it's always case dependent. So you get a lot of advice as a founder in entering new markets. And again, generally entering the US market, the common advice is choose one state and go after that, again, because of the size of the country, and don't go after the very biggest customers. But for us, we knew that we had to go after the entire market and go after the biggest customers first. So along the journey, you've just got to figure out, take all the advice in, like hear it all, and then just figure out what's actually applicable to your situation. You know your company best. You know what your ultimate goals are. How do you apply, parts or none of that advice to your own set of data and skills?
It's almost like risk mitigation, right? It's like, just because someone told you can't do it doesn't mean you can't. It's more like, okay, that's a good thing to understand. How do we actually get over that log that fell on our railway track?
Yep. And everyone is biased by their own experience. And so if you're listening or watching this, some of the advice that I've probably shared won't be useful or relevant to you at all, and that's fine. And it's just figuring out, you've got to almost dissect what is right and not right for you. But the core thing is, make sure you are listening to other people and at least hearing the advice to start with.
Hey Phil, this was a great conversation. Thanks for coming on board, and lovely to have you here.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
I'm Hussein Al-Bedri, producer of These Three Things. This part of the podcast is called The Three Learned Things. Shona and I wanted to briefly reflect on the three key insights we got from today's episode, which is brought to you in association with Callaghan Innovations Upskill products. These products are designed to help startups uncover and acquire the skills they need to succeed.
That was an amazing interview with Phil. Like, I can tell you, it was actually really challenging for me, because I keep listening to him and realizing I had many paths to go down for my follow-up question, because he had a lot to share, and I actually felt like that could have gone a lot deeper and a lot longer. But listening to all of that, Hussein, what did you take away from that?
There were definitely a lot of lessons on a lot of fronts. The first one for me was around raising capital and their approach to that. He talked about the fact that capital constraints are actually a good thing, and he talked about how they bootstrapped for a very long time. It's a theme that's emerged through a couple of other speakers as well. Everyone thinks about raising capital and having a lot of money at hand, but actually capital constraint has the positive side effect of getting you to learn how to be resilient, especially through tough times, getting you to be very creative around how you approach your customers and your product and your growth plans in general. So capital constraints can play to your advantage as well.
It's looking for that. They've found the positive side of that, and it's standing them in good stead now when constraints on them are really tight. The entire market, not on them. Yeah, for me, what was really astounding, and I actually loved, and it became clear to me as to why they're being so successful, is that lead time that they took to do the research before they entered the USA. That was kind of mind-blowing for me. Normally it's, okay, we're going to go to Australia, that's going well, bang, 6 months later, let's go for the United States. But 4 years, that was brilliant. And for me, it's just something I learned from them, and I love it, and I'll take that forward, I think, into other companies I'm with.
So that's really fascinating, because that is a scaling offshore lesson, which is go to the market early, do your research, understand it, and then lay the foundations so that you can get there and land in the long term. The part that was really interesting for me was how their whole mindset was around understanding the customer problem. So from a product market fit as well, understanding the customer problem is where they start. And even when they go to new markets or they go to new customers, they are not going in saying, here is the product, here is the sales pitch. They're actually going in and understanding what are the challenges that customer is facing, and they're creating and building a dialogue with the customer to come back and say, this is how our product is going to incorporate and help you with some of these challenges. And these are the things that are on our roadmap that are going to help you with these challenges. And it showed customers that they were listening, that they were progressing with them. And the interesting part as well is how they built this maturity around their sales cycle, where they understood that big enterprise customers have a long sales cycle. And so they built that in and they planned for it. So it wasn't, it wasn't that they were sitting there desperate to make a sale. They actually had that longer term view, and they knew that this was the kind of cycle that they had to go through.
Can you do me a favour? If you like this episode, can you hit the subscribe button? It really makes a huge difference to us, and it means that we can continue to evolve, grow, and bring more insights from a larger variety of guests. Thank you for listening to These Three Things. Our podcast is fueled by our passion and admiration for startups and the courageous people who create them. A huge thanks to our wonderful listeners and guests, my producer Hussein Al-Badri, our sound and visual crew, Elisa Grishkova and Carl Butler, and our sponsor, Callahan Innovation, who are just as committed and passionate about the ecosystem as we are. Tune in next week for another episode of These Three Things.